One of the little things that I love in The Lord of the Rings takes place very early on. It's a moment that's become rather famous, or maybe a little infamous. It's in the third chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring, the Three is Company chapter, where Frodo, Sam, and Pippin are making their way on foot from Hobbiton to Crickhollow. The passage reads as follows. They set no watch. Even Frodo feared no danger yet, for they were still in the heart of the Shire. A few creatures came and looked at them when the fire had died away. A fox, passing through the wood on business of his own, stopped several minutes and sniffed. Hobbits, he thought. Well, what next? I have heard of strange doings in this land, but I have seldom heard of a hobbit sleeping out of doors under a tree. 3 of them. There is something mighty queer behind this. He was quite right, but he never found out any more about it. Now, much has been said of this moment, and the focus is usually on the rather absurd nature of it. Because, after all, why do we suddenly get a fox's POV in the book? He is in no way central to the story being told, or even secondarily or tertiarily, or as far down as you can go in degrees of irrelevance. He has nothing to do with the plot. No question, the fox is even less connected to the goings-on of the trilogy than Tom Bombadil. At the very least, though, with Tom, he's referenced a few times after we leave him just outside of Bree. We never hear from this fox again. In fact, we never hear about any fox again, with the exception of a single fox outside the Midgewater Marshes, who is only noted as one of the very few 4-legged creatures seen on the march from Bree, along with a few squirrels. The only other time a fox is mentioned in the entire book is as a comparison, in the Great River chapter, when Aragorn calls Gollum slyer than a fox. Meanwhile, we never get a POV from any random animal again. Bill the Pony is the closest we get, but even he does not reveal his innermost thoughts. Bill, of course, is purchased in Bree, and when Strider and the hobbits are leaving, we learn that the pony had improved wonderfully from his time with Bill Ferny, and seemed fatter and stronger, and had begun to show an affection for its new masters. Later, in Rivendell, we learn from Sam that animal can nearly talk. Nearly. And as they prepare to leave there, he was the only member of the company that did not seem depressed. Later, as they're trying to scale Carathras, we learn that Legolas, alone of the company, remained light of heart. Since Bill was called a member of the company before, we can presume he was just as miserable and cold as everyone else. But again, we are never in Bill's head to learn that. Likewise, when they are being encircled by wargs at the foot of Carathras, we learn poor Bill trembled and sweated where he stood. So, showing fear, but we can only presume that from outward appearances. Outside of Moria, when it's revealed that Bill can't come in, and Gandalf speaks words to him to help him get back to Rivendell, we read, Bill, seeming to understand well what was going on, nuzzled up to Sam, putting his nose to Sam's ear. Seeming to understand. Later, we have more of those outward signs of fear at the Watcher in the Water's appearance. Bill the Pony started in fear, and he gave a wild neigh of fear. After that, the next we hear of Bill is many months later, when the hobbits are heading back home through Bree, and we meet up with Bill again, and we're told he seemed well content. Again and again, seemed. We are never in his head. But even if we were, Bill at least has something to do in relation to the story. Not so the fox. Yet, here he is. And Tolkien obviously enjoyed his being here because the fox appears in the very first manuscript version of the chapter, written approximately February 1938, which is Christopher Tolkien's reckoning as revealed in the History of Middle-earth volume, The Shadow of the Past. The hobbits then are Frodo, Odo, and Bingo, with Bingo at this point more or less being the Frodo character that we know of. Sort of. Either way, the text is nearly identical to the published version. Here we go from the manuscript. A fox, passing through the wood on business of his own, stopped several minutes and sniffed. Hobbits, he thought. Well, what next? I have heard of a good many tales of queer goings-on in this shire, but I have never heard of a hobbit sleeping out of doors under a tree. 3 of them. There's something mighty queer behind this. He was quite right, but he never found out any more about it. The difference to note here is that in the original, the fox has never heard of a hobbit sleeping out of doors, but in the published version, he has seldom heard. I guess maybe Bilbo had made his presence known out of doors among the animals at one time, no doubt sleeping in the woods after a very long walk. Doesn't seem out of character for Bilbo. And if he did, it apparently was the talk of the forest, since our fox has heard of it. But it's not merely a question of the fact of the fox being here, but the why. Why are we getting this? And why did it stay? The key, it would seem, is to look at what and how Tolkien was writing when the sequence appeared. It seems pretty clear that we are in the same mode of writing that The Lord of the Rings started out as, it being the sequel to The Hobbit, which is of course how Tolkien referred to this new book that he had begun. At the time of his original composition of the text that included the fox, February 1938, he calls it specifically that in Letter 21, as he tries to get young Rayner Unwin, who was the original reader of the Hobbit manuscript, to take a look at Chapter 1 of the sequel to The Hobbit. And as a sequel to The Hobbit, the original Lord of the Rings text, at its outset, had a rather hobbity kind of feel to it. And by this I mean the lightness of touch within the narration in that book, where we get authorial intrusions all the time, and silly things like a talking purse in a troll's pocket, or stone giants at play. Here in the sequel, we get Hobbit talk, and Hobbit songs, and Hobbit parties, and Hobbit jokes. It's exactly what his publisher was looking for when he asked Tolkien after The Hobbit was published what more he had in the way of writing. Tolkien promptly gave over all of his Silmarillion material, which was nearer to his heart, and which he had been working on for about 20 years at this point. The publisher clarified, oh, no, we want more about hobbits. Well, after a bit of hemming and hawing, Tolkien did start to produce exactly that. And what he was producing carries that Hobbit tone throughout its earliest compositions. The eventual book of The Lord of the Rings loses that tone eventually, and assumes the level of high romance, even venturing into what one could call biblical touches, which the Silmarillion is much more full of. But it takes a while for the book to get there, and Tolkien, as the writer, does not change it, even with the many rewritings which the opening chapters went through. It seems to be that the further out from the original source of The Hobbit, and by that I mean the beginning of that book, Hobbiton, the Shire itself, the less hobbity the text becomes. It's like our 3 hobbits, Frodo, Sam, and Pippin, in Three is Company. We are still in the Shire. And like the fact that they set no watch, there doesn't seem to be any harm in having this odd little diversion into a fox's thought on what is happening, not only in front of his own eyes, but within the wider world. The fact that we get no other animal POV later on is because we are far from the Shire, and the places where fun things like that happen. Because, I mean, it is fun, which is what The Hobbit is, and what hobbits are, as much as they can be. And it does have a kind of point to the story as a whole. It teases the idea that there are bigger doings going on in the world, which, as we read on, we will certainly get to. Of course, it's not as if we didn't know that already. We're told earlier on about the migration of dwarves and elves sailing away from Middle-earth. So, do we really need the fox to confirm it for us? I suppose it's not a bad thing to reinforce the fact, and to signal what is happening outside the Shire with something so innocuous as 3 hobbits sleeping out of doors. But let's face it, even with The Hobbit under our belts, we as readers only have so much experience with hobbits in general. And so their sleeping out of doors may not seem so odd to the casual reader. The presence of the fox tells us otherwise. But something that has struck me is not so much that we have an animal POV telling us this. It's more the question of, why a fox? Why not a squirrel, or a rabbit, or an owl? Any one of these would be valid in terms of doing what the fox does here, seeing hobbits and commenting on its oddity. Yet, we have a fox. Now, I have zero proof of this, but I think I have the answer. It can be found in the novel The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany, published in 1924. Edward John Morton Drax Plunkett, 18th Baron Dunsany, or just Lord Dunsany, 1878 to 1957, was a prolific writer. Novels, plays, books, essays, stories, you name it. And he produced a number of works in what we would call the fantasy genre. The King of Elfland's Daughter is a work of fantasy, featuring a fairy princess who was brought from Elfland, or fairy, the land of fairies, fairyland, whatever you want to call it. She's brought from Elfland into our world to marry a prince. Things aren't quite so simple as all that, but that's the gist. And while we have no proof that Tolkien ever read that book, we do know, thanks to the scholarship of Holly Ordway in her book Tolkien's Modern Reading, that Tolkien did know Lord Dunsany. He references Dunsany's The Book of Wonder in his letters. He also evokes Dunsany himself very briefly when he was presenting his Silmarillion material to his publisher. His awareness of Dunsany is noteworthy in this discussion of the fox in the Shire, because the King of Elfland's Daughter references foxes. A lot. And in a very curious way. It occurs first in Chapter 7, The Coming of the Troll, when the King of Elfland sends a troll into our world to retrieve his daughter. The text reads, "Presently he, the troll, saw rising up, all white, over the flowers, a fox that was facing him, with his white chest and chin, and watching the troll as it went. The troll went near to him and took a look, and the fox went on watching him, for the fox watches all things. He had come back lately to those dewy fields from slinking by night along the boundary of twilight that lies between here and Elfland. He even prowls inside the very boundary, walking amongst the twilight. And it is in the mystery of that heavy twilight that lies between here and there that there clings to him some of that glamour that he brings with him to our fields." Later, in Chapter 18, The Grey Tent in the Evening, Dunsany goes deeper into that concept of the fox prowling the very boundary between here and Elfland. The fox, which is born in our fields, also crosses the frontier, going into the border of twilight at certain seasons. It is thence that he gets the romance with which he comes back to our fields. He is also fabulous, but only in Elfland, as the unicorns are fabulous here. Later still, in Chapter 19, 12 Old Men Without Magic, we read, "A fox heard them coming, and stood quite still and listened. At first he was puzzled. Then he caught the scent of the unicorn, and all was clear to him, for he knew by the magic flavor that it was something coming from Elfland." There's more. Chapter 22, Orion appoints a whip. Orion is the son of the King of Elfland's Daughter. He, Orion, went with his hounds along the last hedge, down to the boundary, and no sooner had he come there than he saw a fox quite close slip out of the twilight between earth and Elfland, and run a few yards along the edge of our fields, and then slip back again. And of this Orion thought nothing, for it is the way of the fox thus to haunt the edge of Elfland, and to return again to our fields. It is thus that he brings us something of which none of our cities guess. But soon the fox appeared again out of the twilight, and ran a little way, and was back in the luminous barrier once more. Then Orion watched to see what the fox was doing, and yet again it appeared in the field we know, and dodged back into the twilight. And the hounds watched too, and showed no longing to hunt it, for they had tasted fabulous blood. And finally, chapter 26, the return of Lurelu. We are back to the dogs. We learn that dogs bark at gypsies, tramps, and all those that go without houses, at the wild things of the woods, and at the fox. For his touch of mystery and his far wanderings, they bark more furiously. So, the fox is set up here as a very special animal, one who comes and goes into Elfland, or fairy, perhaps not too deeply, but enough that he has a fabulous quality about him, and he himself knows the magic flavor of something coming out of Elfland. He is considered fabulous himself, but only in Elfland, which is curious since everything is fabulous over there, at least to us. It's Elfland, after all. It's fairy. Yet the fox, of all creatures, is considered fabulous, the same way we would consider a unicorn fabulous. I mean, foxes equal unicorns? Now, again, there's no proof of this, but could this fox of Tolkien's, prowling around the woody end of the Shire, be of the same kind as Lord Dunsany's fox, who prowls the twilight between here and Fairy? After all, is it a coincidence that the fox is seen here, in this spot, at this time, and very shortly afterward, Frodo, Sam, and Pippin will meet the High Elf Gildor and his kinfolk, elves who, in essence, take the place of those beings from Fairy in the traditional sense? Now, it's clear that elves do not live in these woods. Frodo tells Sam that, just as it's also clear that these elves are moving through these woods on their way to the Grey Havens. But their presence calls attention to itself, and could perhaps be drawing the fox. Could this be that business of his own that the text references? Basically, a move toward the elves who are coming this way? Is the fox sensing that fabulous blood that we are told the dogs in Dunsany sense on the fox after he's been in Elfland? It's especially more of a thought-provoker when you hear what the elves actually say when they see the hobbits. This is indeed wonderful, which in this context I think needs to be taken not as we might use the word wonderful, lovely and splendid, but literally, wonderful, full of wonder, that is completely unexpected and astonishing. "This is indeed wonderful," they said. "3 hobbits in a wood at night. We have not seen such a thing since Bilbo went away. What is the meaning of it?" That's the elves. And now let's remember what the fox said. "Well, what next? I have heard of strange doings in this land, but I have seldom heard of a hobbit sleeping out of doors under a tree. 3 of them. There's something mighty queer behind this." Mighty indeed. So, is Tolkien's fox really Dunsany's fox? Perhaps. But whether he is or not, he is here and always will be. And as a result, he is another one of the little things I love in The Lord of the Rings. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.